The unusual arrival. The morning began like any other in the quiet suburb of Willow Creek. The sun bathed the neat rows of houses in a golden glow, and the familiar sounds of birds chirping and lawnmowers humming filled the air. Jake Donovan, a young man in his late 20s, sat on his porch, sipping his coffee and enjoying the peace of the neighborhood. Life here was predictable, and that was how Jake liked it, until the day the moving truck arrived. Jake's attention was drawn to the commotion next door. A sleek, futuristic-looking vehicle, unlike any he had ever seen, hovered silently in the driveway. He squinted, trying to make sense of it. The truck's design didn't look human, and as workers unloaded strange, glowing crates, Jake's curiosity grew. Then she stepped out. Jake nearly spilled his coffee as he caught sight of the newcomer. She was tall, with shimmering silver hair that seemed to flow like liquid metal down her back. Her skin had a faint iridescent glow, and her deep violet eyes scanned the surroundings with an intensity that made Jake's heart skip a beat. She wore a long, flowing robe that shifted colors subtly, reflecting the sunlight like a living rainbow. Jake wasn't the only one noticing her. Curtains twitched in windows, and neighbors peeked out from behind their doors. Whispers began to ripple through the street. Who is she? Is she an alien? I've never seen anything like her before. Jake's neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, approached him on the porch, clutching her dog tightly. Did you see her? She whispered, her eyes wide. I heard the government is relocating aliens to live among us. Integration, they call it. Jake shrugged, though he couldn't take his eyes off the woman. I don't know, but she's different. As the day went on, the neighborhood buzzed with gossip. Jake tried to focus on his work, but his mind kept drifting back to his new neighbor. Who was she? Why was she here? He decided he'd find out for himself. Later that evening, Jake went outside to take out the trash. The mysterious woman was standing in her front yard, looking up at the sky. Her violet eyes reflected the stars, and she seemed lost in thought. Gathering his courage, Jake approached her. Hi there, he said, trying to sound casual. I'm Jake. I live next door. The woman turned her gaze toward him, and Jake felt as though she could see right through him. For a moment, he was struck silent, captivated by her presence. Then she smiled, a warm, inviting smile that made his nervousness fade. Hello, Jake. I am Lyra, she said, her voice soft yet carrying an otherworldly resonance. It's nice to meet you. So, are you new to the neighborhood? Jake mentally kicked himself for asking such an obvious question. Lyra chuckled lightly, a sound like wind chimes. Yes, I arrived today. This place is different from where I come from. Jake hesitated. He didn't want to pry, but his curiosity got the better of him. And where is that, if you don't mind me asking? Lyra's smile faded slightly, and she glanced back at the sky. Far away, a place you wouldn't recognize. Before Jake could press further, a sudden, sweet scent filled the air. It was faint at first, like wildflowers blooming in the wind, but it quickly grew stronger. Jake blinked, feeling lightheaded. His heart began to race, and he couldn't tell if it was because of Lyra's beauty or the strange effect of the scent. He rubbed his temples, trying to shake off the feeling. Are you okay? Lyra asked, concern flickering in her eyes. Yeah, I think so, Jake replied, though he wasn't sure. The scent seemed to linger, making it hard to focus. What is that smell? It's unusual. Lyra looked uneasy, almost guilty. It's nothing. Just something natural to my kind. I'm sorry if it bothers you. Before Jake could respond, Lyra stepped back. I should go inside. It was nice meeting you, Jake. She turned and disappeared into her house, leaving Jake standing there, bewildered. The scent lingered in the air long after she was gone, wrapping around him like an invisible net. He shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts, but it was no use. Something about Lyra was different, something he couldn't ignore. As Jake returned to his house, He noticed that the street had gone unusually quiet. The usual chatter of neighbors and barking of dogs had faded. It was as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath. Later that night, Jake lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. His mind raced with thoughts of Lyra. He had only spoken to her briefly, but she had already left an indelible impression. Who was she really? Why did she seem so guarded? And what was that scent that had clouded his mind? Just as he began to drift off to sleep, a noise outside startled him. He sat up, heart pounding. Peering through his window, he saw a faint glow coming from Lyra's house. It wasn't like any light he had seen before. Soft, pulsating, and almost alive. Unable to resist, Jake grabbed his jacket and headed outside. He had to know more about his mysterious new neighbor. Cliffhanger. As Jake approached Lyra's house, the glow intensified, and the faint scent returned, pulling him closer. His hand trembled as he reached for her doorbell, not knowing what awaited him on the other side. An unexpected encounter. The night air was still, the kind of quiet that made every sound seem amplified. Jake's heart thudded in his chest as he stood at Lyra's door, his hand hovering over the sleek, glowing doorbell. The faint scent, wild, intoxicating, grew stronger, clouding his mind. He shook his head, trying to focus. Something about this felt wrong, yet he couldn't walk away. Before he could press the doorbell, the door slid open soundlessly. Lyra stood there, her violet eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. She wasn't wearing her earlier robe. Instead, she had on something that looked like armor, sleek and reflective, pulsing with faint blue lights. "I was expecting you," she said calmly, as though his late-night visit were entirely normal. Jake froze. "You? Were?" Lyra tilted her head, studying him. "Humans are predictable. I knew you'd be curious enough to come." Her lips curved into a knowing smile. "Come in, Jake." Jake hesitated. Everything about this situation screamed danger, but his legs moved before his mind could argue. He stepped into her home, and the door closed behind him with a soft hum. The air inside was different, warmer, heavier, filled with that same alluring scent. It wrapped around him like a cocoon, making it hard to think straight. Her house was nothing like he expected. The walls seemed alive, shifting colors and patterns as if responding to unseen commands. Strange, floating orbs of light hovered in the corners, illuminating the space in soft, ethereal hues. Furniture that defied gravity hung suspended in midair, and a series of holographic displays flickered along one wall, showing alien landscapes Jake couldn't even begin to describe. "This is incredible," Jake whispered, turning in a slow circle. Lyra watched him with a faint smile. "It's standard where I come from. I imagine it seems strange to you." "That's an understatement," Jake muttered. "Where do you come from, exactly?" Lyra didn't answer right away. She moved to a floating console and waved her hand over it. A hologram appeared, displaying a cluster of stars that Jake didn't recognize. "My home is far from here," she said softly. "A place your kind hasn't discovered yet." Jake stared at the hologram, captivated. "Why are you here then? Why move to a human neighborhood?" Lyra's expression darkened, and for the first time, Jake saw something vulnerable in her eyes. "That's complicated." Before he could press further, a sudden vibration shook the house. The walls shimmered and the lights dimmed. Lyra's eyes narrowed, and she turned to a holographic screen that lit up with alien symbols Jake couldn't decipher. "What's happening?" Jake asked, panic rising in his voice. Lyra's fingers moved swiftly over the console. "They found me," she muttered under her breath. Who's found you?" Jake took a step closer, his heart racing. Lyra turned to him, her expression unreadable. "I need you to trust me, Jake. No matter what happens, don't leave this house." The vibration intensified, and a strange, low hum filled the air. Jake stumbled as the ground beneath him seemed to ripple. Through the window, he saw faint, glowing shapes moving in the shadows outside. "What is going on?" Jake demanded, his voice trembling. Lyra moved toward him, placing a hand on his shoulder. Her touch was cool, and yet it sent a strange warmth coursing through him. "Listen to me carefully," she said, her voice steady but urgent. "The people outside are not your concern. They're here for me. If you stay out of sight, you'll be safe." Jake shook his head. "Safe? Lyra, I don't even know what's going on. Why are they after you? What did you do?" "I didn't do anything wrong," she replied, her tone defensive. "But to them, I'm a threat. They won't stop until they take me back." "Back where?" "Someplace I will never go again," Lyra said firmly. "Please, Jake, just stay here." Jake hesitated. Every instinct told him to run, to get as far away from this as possible. But then he looked at Lyra. The fear in her eyes, the way her shoulders tensed as if bracing for a fight. Against all logic, he found himself nodding. "Okay," he said. "I'll stay." Lyra gave him a grateful look before turning back to the console. Her fingers danced over the controls, and a shimmering barrier appeared around the windows and doors. The hum outside grew louder, and Jake caught glimpses of figures, tall, cloaked shapes with glowing eyes, approaching the house. "Who are they?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Enforcers," Lyra said bitterly. "They're here to bring me back to my people. They think I'm dangerous because of what I am." Jake's mind reeled. "And what exactly are you?" Lyra paused, meeting his gaze. "A survivor," she said simply. "And if I don't fight back, I won't survive much longer." Cliffhanger. As the first blast hit the barrier, sending sparks flying through the room, Jake realized he had just stepped into a conflict far beyond anything he could have imagined. The pheromone effect. The house trembled under the impact of the blasts, and the shimmering barrier flickered with each hit. Jake staggered backward, his heart pounding. The figures outside grew clearer now. Tall, cloaked beings with sleek, metallic armor that glinted under the dim light of the neighborhood. Their glowing, unblinking eyes bore down on the house with eerie precision. "What are they?" Jake asked, his voice barely audible over the hum of the barrier. "They're not your concern," Lyra replied sharply, her fingers flying across the console. Her calm demeanor had turned steely, and her glowing violet eyes burned with determination. "Stay behind me, Jake." But Jake wasn't the type to sit still, even when logic screamed at him to run. "You keep saying that, but they're here. They're blasting your house like they're about to come in and tear it apart. Don't you think I deserve some answers?" Lyra stopped what she was doing and turned to him. Her glowing eyes softened for a moment, but only a moment. "You're human. This fight isn't yours." "Maybe not," Jake said, straightening his shoulders. "But I'm in it now, thanks to you." Lyra sighed and muttered something in her native tongue, a sound like a whispering breeze. Then, with a wave of her hand, the shimmering barrier pulsed outward, sending a shockwave that momentarily pushed the cloaked figures back. "They're enforcers from my home planet," she began, her voice low and urgent. "Their job is to capture or eliminate anyone who breaks our laws. I didn't break any laws. They're afraid of me because of my abilities." Jake frowned. "Abilities like the pheromones?" Lyra blinked, clearly surprised he'd figured it out. "Yes, my species emits them naturally, but mine are unique, too powerful. They think I can manipulate minds, control others. It's not true, but fear doesn't care about the truth." Jake's thoughts raced. The strange scent he'd noticed around her suddenly made sense. It wasn't just pleasant. It was overpowering, almost intoxicating. He felt his pulse quicken just standing near her. "They think you're dangerous," Jake said slowly, piecing it together. "But you're not, are you?" Lyra's gaze didn't waver. "I've never harmed anyone. But they won't take the chance. They want to lock me away or worse." Before Jake could respond, another blast hit the barrier, and this time, it flickered dangerously. Sparks flew from the console, and Lyra cursed under her breath. She turned to Jake, her expression grim. "The shield won't hold much longer," she said. "When it goes down, they'll come for me. You need to hide." Jake clenched his fists. "I'm not hiding. If they want you, they'll have to get through me first." Lyra stared at him, something unreadable flashing in her eyes. "You're brave, Jake, but bravery won't stop them." Another blast rocked the house, and Jake stumbled. The scent in the air grew stronger, making his head swim. He shook it off, focusing on Lyra. "What can we do? There has to be a way to stop them." Lyra hesitated. "There is one thing, but it's dangerous." "Dangerous how?" She stepped closer to him, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "My pheromones affect humans more than other species. If I amplify them, I could influence their minds, confuse them, maybe even drive them away. But it would also affect you." Jake swallowed hard. "Affect me how?" Lyra's gaze dropped. "The stronger the pheromones, the harder it is to resist. You'd lose control of your emotions, your thoughts. You might not even recognize yourself." Jake's heart raced. The idea was terrifying, but the alternative was worse. He looked at Lyra, her glowing eyes filled with worry, and made his decision. "Do it," he said firmly. Lyra's eyes widened. "Jake, I don't care what happens to me," he interrupted. "If it means keeping you safe, it's worth it." For a moment, Lyra just stared at him, as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. Then, with a nod, she placed a hand on his chest. Her touch sent a shiver through him, and the air around them grew heavy, almost electric. "Stay close to me," she said, "and don't fight it. The more you resist, the worse it will feel." Jake nodded, though his stomach churned with uncertainty. Lyra closed her eyes, and the faint glow of her skin intensified. The sweet floral scent in the air became overpowering, wrapping around Jake like a blanket. His knees buckled, and he grabbed the edge of the floating console to steady himself. Outside, the enforcers froze mid-step. Their glowing eyes flickered, and they staggered as if disoriented. One by one, they began to retreat, their movements sluggish and uncoordinated. Jake's vision blurred. His heart raced, and a strange warmth spread through his body, making it hard to think. He felt a surge of emotions, fear, awe, longing, all jumbled together. Lyra's voice cut through the haze. "Jake, stay with me," she said, her tone urgent. I'm trying," he managed to say, though his words felt distant, as if they weren't his own. As the last of the enforcers disappeared into the shadows, Lyra collapsed to her knees, her glow fading. The intoxicating scent began to dissipate, and Jake's head cleared enough to stumble toward her. "Lyra, are you okay?" he asked, kneeling beside her. She looked up at him, her eyes dull but still beautiful. "I didn't think you'd survive that," she said weakly. Jake forced a smile. "You'll find humans are full of surprises, a hidden agenda." The air was heavy with tension as the cryptic alien message glowed ominously on the console. Jake's pulse quickened as he watched Lyra's expression shift from exhaustion to dread. She stared at the screen, her lips moving silently as if confirming the translation in her head. "What does it mean?" Jake asked, breaking the silence. Lyra didn't meet his gaze. Instead, she reached for the console and tapped a sequence of glowing symbols. The message disappeared, replaced by a holographic map. Jake recognized Earth in the center, but surrounding it were unfamiliar ships marked in red, moving closer. "They're sending reinforcements," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They won't stop until they have me." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. "Why are they so obsessed with you? You said you didn't do anything wrong." Lyra finally turned to face him, her expression conflicted. "I didn't, but where I come from, power is feared, not celebrated. My pheromones, my ability, are considered too dangerous. They think if I stay free, I could destabilize their entire system." Jake frowned. "That still doesn't explain why they'd go to these lengths. There has to be more to this." Lyra hesitated, then sighed. There is. My abilities aren't just about pheromones. I can influence emotions, yes, but if pushed far enough. She paused, as if the next words pained her. I can alter thoughts, control decisions. Jake took a step back, his mind racing. Control, like brainwashing. Not exactly, Lyra said quickly. It's more like persuasion. I don't use it, Jake. I've never wanted that kind of power. But the council doesn't believe me. They think I'm a threat, and they'll do anything to neutralize me. Jake's thoughts spiraled. The enforcers, the pheromones, the strange effects on his own mind. Everything began to connect. But one thing didn't add up. If they're so scared of you, why did they let you come to Earth in the first place? Lyra's shoulders sagged, and she sank into a floating chair. They didn't. I escaped. Earth was supposed to be my safe haven. Humans are different, resistant, in ways other species aren't. I thought I could live quietly here, unnoticed. She gestured to the glowing console. I was wrong. Before Jake could respond, a sharp beep cut through the room. Lyra's eyes darted to the screen. The map zoomed in, showing one of the red ships breaking away from the others and heading straight for their location. They're here, she said, her voice tight. Jake's mind raced. Can't we use the barrier again? Lyra shook her head. It's too weak after the last attack. I need time to recharge it. Then what do we do? Jake asked, panic creeping into his voice. Lyra stood, her resolve hardening. We fight. Jake blinked. Fight. Lyra, I'm not exactly trained for alien combat. You won't have to be, she said, moving to a hidden panel in the wall. With a wave of her hand, it slid open, revealing the small cache of alien devices. She pulled out a sleek, metallic disc and handed it to him. What's this? Jake asked, turning it over in his hands. Personal shield, Lyra explained. It'll protect you, mostly. Stay close to me, and you'll be fine. Jake swallowed hard, his grip tightening on the device. And you? What about you? Lyra smiled faintly. I can handle myself. Before he could argue, the house shook violently. The barrier flickered and then collapsed, leaving them exposed. Jake's heart pounded as he saw the shadowy figures outside regrouping, their weapons glowing with a menacing light. Stay behind me, Lyra ordered. Stepping forward, the enforcers breached the house in a blur of motion. Their sleek, metallic armor gleamed under the alien lights, and their glowing eyes locked onto Lyra. Jake activated the shield just in time to block a blast of energy that sent him stumbling backward. Lyra, however, was a force of nature. Her iridescent skin began to glow brighter, and the scent, the pheromones, returned in full force. The enforcers hesitated, their movements faltering as if caught in an invisible web. Lyra raised her hands, and a pulse of light erupted from her, sending the nearest enforcers sprawling. Jake watched in awe and terror. She wasn't just defending herself. She was overwhelming them, her presence filling the room with an almost tangible energy. The enforcers began to retreat, their weapons clattering to the floor as they stumbled out of the house. But it wasn't over. The ship outside loomed closer, its massive form casting a shadow over the street. Lyra turned to Jake, her glow dimming slightly. I need you to do something for me. Anything, Jake said without hesitation. She handed him a small, crystal-like device. Take this to the console and activate it. It'll send a signal to someone who can help us. Who? Jake asked, clutching the device. You'll know when they answer, she said cryptically. Go, now. Jake bolted for the console, dodging debris as another blast rocked the house. He fumbled with the device, fitting it into a glowing slot. The screen flared to life, displaying alien symbols that shifted into something resembling English. Cliffhanger. The words on the screen made Jake's blood run cold. Hill P re Q U East A C King and O W L E G T. Responding unite. Humanity's defense initiative. Jake stared in shock as the symbol of Earth's military appeared alongside a message. Stand by for intervention. Danger lurking close. The holographic display glowed with the insignia of Earth's Humanities Defense Initiative, HFY, a name Jake had only heard in conspiracy theories and late-night internet rabbit holes. The words, "Stand by for intervention," blinked ominously, but the screen offered no further instructions. Jake's fingers hovered over the console. "Lyra," he called, his voice strained. "Who exactly is this Humanities Defense Initiative?" "They're real." Lyra glanced over her shoulder, her glow dimming as she regained her strength. "Your planet's secret response force." I didn't think they would answer, but desperate times. She trailed off, her gaze hardening. "They won't help us for free, Jake. They'll want something in return." The distant hum of the alien ship grew louder, the sound vibrating through the floor like the growl of an approaching predator. Jake's chest tightened. "What do you mean? What could they possibly want from us?" "Information," Lyra replied grimly. "Technology. Access to my abilities. Things that could tip the balance of power in your favor and destabilize the galaxy even further." Before Jake could process the implications, a deafening roar cut through the night. The alien ship had descended low enough to rattle nearby houses, its blinding searchlights sweeping the area. The remaining enforcers regrouped at the perimeter, their glowing eyes scanning the house with unnerving precision. Lyra grabbed Jake's arm, her strength catching him off guard. "We don't have time to debate this. Activate the signal fully. If they don't come, we won't survive." Jake hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. "And if they do come, what happens to you?" Lyra's expression softened, a flicker of vulnerability breaking through her resolve. "That's a risk I'm willing to take." Jake clenched his jaw, his heart pounding. He turned back to the console and pressed the glowing confirmation symbol. The hologram pulsed, sending a wave of light rippling across the room. A mechanical voice filled the air. "Signal received. Ground unit en route. ETA. 4 minutes." Lyra exhaled sharply, relief flickering in her eyes. But the moment was short-lived. The alien ship above shifted, its underside opening to reveal a glowing orb that pulsed with malevolent energy. Jake's instincts screamed danger. "What's that?" he asked, pointing to the orb. "An extraction beacon," Lyra said, her voice tight. "If they activate it, I'll be immobilized. They'll take me, and anyone who resists will not survive." Jake's mind raced. "How do we stop it?" Lyra shook her head. "We can't, not with the resources we have here. We have to stall until the HDI arrives." The enforcers advanced toward the house, their movements synchronized and purposeful. Jake gripped the personal shield device Lyra had given him, his knuckles white. "How do we stall an alien death squad?" Lyra's glow intensified again, and the familiar, intoxicating scent returned. Jake staggered slightly but steadied himself, his body already beginning to adapt. Lyra stepped forward, her voice calm but commanding. "Stay close to me," she said. "I'll draw their attention. You focus on surviving." "Not exactly reassuring," Jake muttered, but he followed her lead. The first enforcer breached the doorway, its tall frame almost scraping the ceiling. It moved with mechanical precision, raising a weapon that hummed ominously. Lyra raised her hand, and the air shimmered as an invisible force slammed into the intruder, sending it crashing into the wall. The scent grew stronger, enveloping the room like a living entity. Jake felt a strange mix of fear and exhilaration, his mind sharpening even as his body felt unnervingly light. The remaining enforcers hesitated, their glowing eyes flickering as if they were struggling to focus. "They're sensitive to pheromones too," Lyra said, her voice strained. "But they'll adapt quickly. We need to move." Jake nodded, his grip tightening on the shield. They darted toward the back of the house, dodging blasts of energy that tore through walls and furniture. The house groaned under the assault, debris falling around them like rain. Outside, the alien ship emitted a low, resonant hum. The orb beneath it began to glow brighter, casting an eerie light across the neighborhood. Jake glanced up and froze. "It's charging," he said, his voice laced with dread. "Lyra, we're out of time." Lyra clenched her fists, her glow pulsating like a heartbeat. "Then we make time." She turned back to the enforcers, her presence radiating an intensity that made Jake's knees weak. The intruders faltered again, their weapons lowering slightly as if caught in a trance. Lyra's voice rang out, firm and commanding. "Leave now, and you'll be spared. Stay, and you'll face the consequences." The enforcers didn't respond, but their hesitation bought precious seconds. Jake's comm device crackled to life, and a gruff human voice came through. "This is Captain Reed of the HDI. Ground team incoming. Hold your position." Jake felt a surge of hope. "They're almost here." Lyra's gaze didn't waver from the enforcers. "Then let's make sure they have something to arrive for." Cliffhanger. The ship above emitted a deafening pulse, and the glowing orb launched a beam of energy toward the house. Lyra tackled Jake to the ground just as the beam struck, engulfing everything in blinding light. As the world around him blurred, Jake heard the distant roar of approaching HDI dropships. A growing bond. The blinding light faded, leaving Jake's ears ringing and his vision blurred. He groaned, pushing himself up from the rubble. The house was barely standing, its walls scorched and crumbling. Smoke filled the air, and the faint hum of the alien ship echoed ominously above. "Lyra," Jake called out, his voice hoarse. A hand gripped his arm, pulling him upright. Lyra's face appeared, her glow dim but steady. She looked exhausted, her once vivid eyes now shadowed with strain. "I'm here," she said, her voice trembling but determined. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine," Jake lied, wincing as he moved. "What about you?" "That blast." "I'll survive," she interrupted. Her eyes darted to the sky, where the alien ship loomed closer, the extraction beacon still glowing ominously. "But we're not safe yet." The ground shook as another surge of energy rippled through the air, and Jake turned to see the enforcers regrouping outside. They moved with renewed focus, their weapons glowing brighter as they advanced. Lyra grabbed Jake's arm again, pulling him behind what was left of a wall. "They're adapting," she said, her tone grim. "My pheromones won't confuse them for much longer." Jake clenched his fists, frustration bubbling inside him. "Then what do we do?" "The HDI said they were coming, but if those enforcers get to us first—" "They won't," Lyra said firmly, though her voice wavered slightly. "We won't let them." Jake glanced at her, his mind racing. For all her strength and abilities, she was just as vulnerable as he was, and the weight of the situation pressed down on him. He couldn't let her face this alone. "We fight together," he said, his voice steady. Lyra turned to him, her eyes searching his face. For a moment, the chaos around them seemed to fade. "You don't have to do this, Jake," she said softly. "You've already risked more than I could have asked." Jake shook his head. "You're not just some alien in trouble. You're my friend. And friends don't leave each other behind." Her expression softened, a flicker of something unreadable crossing her face. "You're a strange human, Jake Donovan." Before he could respond, the enforcers surged forward, their weapons raised. Lyra moved first, stepping into the open and unleashing a burst of energy that sent the front line stumbling. Jake activated his personal shield and followed her, dodging blasts of energy as they worked together to push the attackers back. The enforcers were relentless, their movements precise and coordinated. Jake ducked behind cover, firing a makeshift projectile weapon Lyra had handed him earlier. It wasn't much, but it bought them precious seconds. Lyra, meanwhile, was a blur of light and motion, her pheromones creating pockets of confusion among the attackers. But it wasn't enough. The enforcers pressed on, their glowing eyes locked on Lyra. One broke through her defenses, raising a weapon that crackled with lethal energy. Jake didn't think, he acted. He launched himself at the enforcer, using the shield to absorb the impact as they tumbled to the ground. The Enforcer's weapon discharged, narrowly missing Lyra. Jake gritted his teeth as the Enforcer's weight pinned him down. His shield flickered, struggling to hold. "Lyra, a little help here," he shouted. Lyra turned, her eyes blazing with renewed intensity. She raised her hand, and the Enforcer froze, its glowing eyes dimming as if its systems were shutting down. Jake rolled out from under it, gasping for breath. "Thanks," he said, staggering to his feet. Lyra nodded, but her glow was fading rapidly. "We can't keep this up," she admitted, her voice strained. "Not without reinforcements." As if on cue, a deafening roar filled the air. Jake looked up to see streaks of light cutting through the sky. HFY dropships, their sleek forms glinting as they descended. The Enforcers turned their attention to the new arrivals, their weapons shifting focus. The dropships landed with a heavy thud, their doors sliding open to reveal armored soldiers armed with advanced weaponry. The HFY team wasted no time, firing precise energy blasts that forced the Enforcers to retreat. Jake felt a surge of relief as the tide of the battle turned. One of the soldiers, a tall figure in black armor, approached Jake and Lyra. His helmet retracted, revealing a grizzled man with piercing blue eyes. "Captain Reed," he introduced himself. His gaze shifted to Lyra, narrowing slightly. "You must be the reason for all this." Lyra straightened, her expression guarded. "I didn't ask for their attack." Reed nodded, his tone unreadable. "No, but you're why they're here. And now that we're involved, there are going to be questions." Jake stepped forward, his shield flickering out as he deactivated it. "She saved my life," he said firmly. "More than once. Whatever you think, she's not the enemy." Reed's eyes flicked to Jake, then back to Lyra. "We'll see about that. For now, we need to get you both out of here." Lyra hesitated, her gaze darting to the alien ship above. "They won't stop," she said. "Not until they have me." "Let them try," Reed replied, a faint smirk crossing his face. "We've been waiting for a chance to show them what humanity can do." Cliffhanger. As the soldiers formed a defensive perimeter, the alien ship began to transform, its sleek edges folding and shifting into a massive weapon. Reed's smirk vanished. "Everyone, move. That's no ordinary ship. It's a planetary disruptor." Jake's blood ran cold as he realized the true scale of the threat. What the hell is a planetary disruptor? Lyra's voice was barely a whisper. "It's their way of making sure no one wins." The final confrontation. The alien ship hovered ominously above, its transforming structure emitting a deep, resonant hum that seemed to shake the very ground beneath them. Jake's breath caught as he saw massive energy conduits forming along the ship's underside, glowing with a malevolent light. This was no mere weapon. It was a declaration of annihilation. "Planetary disruptor," Lyra repeated, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "It's not designed to destroy a planet outright. It destabilizes the core, creating quakes and eruptions until the surface is uninhabitable." Reed turned to his squad, his voice sharp and commanding. "We've got minutes, maybe less. Target that ship's power core and light it up." The HFY soldiers sprang into action, their advanced weaponry locking onto the ship. Beams of concentrated energy surged upward, but the disruptor's shields absorbed them effortlessly. The ship retaliated, firing precise blasts that sent soldiers diving for cover. Jake pulled Lyra behind a collapsed wall as the ground shook violently. "Can we stop it?" he asked, his voice tight with desperation. "There's a chance," Lyra said, her gaze fixed on the ship. "The disruptor's core is unstable while it's powering up. If we can overload it, it'll implode instead of firing." "Overload it how?" Jake asked. Lyra hesitated, then reached for the small crystal device she'd handed him earlier. "This can do it. It's a failsafe I built into my escape plan." "But..." She trailed off, her expression conflicted. "But what?" Jake pressed. It has to be activated inside the ship, she said quietly. Manually. Jake's stomach dropped. You mean, someone has to go up there? Lyra nodded. The disruptor's shields are calibrated against large-scale weapons, but they're vulnerable to smaller objects. A stealth approach could work. Jake stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. You're not going alone. You don't have to do this, Lyra said, her voice soft but firm. This fight isn't yours, Jake. Jake met her gaze, his resolve hardening. You said it yourself. Humans are full of surprises. Let's prove it. Before Lyra could argue, Reed approached, overhearing their conversation. If you're going, you're not going alone, he said gruffly. We'll provide cover and get you close. But make it quick. This thing goes off. We're all vapor. Lyra handed the crystal device to Jake, her fingers brushing his. Keep it steady. Once you reach the core, it will do the rest. Jake nodded, his pulse pounding as adrenaline surged through him. Got it. The final push. The HFY deployed a stealth drone, its sleek frame designed for infiltration. Jake and Lyra climbed aboard, the small craft barely big enough for the two of them. As the drone lifted off, Jake glanced out the window, watching the battle unfold below. The HFY soldiers fought valiantly, their weapons lighting up the night as they kept the enforcers at bay. Why did you really escape to Earth? Jake asked suddenly, his voice cutting through the hum of the drone's engines. Lyra hesitated, her gaze distant. Because your species. You're resilient. Creative. I thought if anyone could understand me, it would be humans. I didn't expect to find someone like you. Jake's chest tightened, but before he could respond, the drone jolted. They had breached the disruptor's shields. The interior of the ship came into view, a labyrinth of glowing conduits and pulsating energy fields. We're in, Lyra said, her voice steady. The core is straight ahead. The drone landed smoothly, and the two of them disembarked. The air inside the ship was stifling, thick with the hum of energy. Jake followed Lyra through the maze-like corridors, clutching the crystal device tightly. They reached the core chamber, a massive, glowing sphere suspended in midair by energy beams. The heat was almost unbearable, and the vibrations rattled Jake's teeth. Place the device at the base, Lyra instructed. It'll synchronize with the core's energy flow. Jake moved quickly, sweat dripping down his face as he secured the device. It began to glow, emitting a low hum that grew louder with each passing second. It's done, he said, turning to Lyra. Now what? Now we run, Lyra said, grabbing his hand. The countdown. As they sprinted back to the drone, the ship began to shudder violently. The core's energy output spiked, sending arcs of electricity ripping through the corridors. Alarms blared, and the air grew thick with the scent of burning metal. Faster, Lyra urged, pulling Jake along. They reached the drone just as the ship's defenses activated. Automated turrets sprang to life, firing bursts of plasma that narrowly missed them. Jake dove into the drone, pulling Lyra in after him. The craft lifted off, its engine screaming as it raced toward the shield's edge. Below, the HFY soldiers watched in awe as the alien ship began to implode. The glowing orb at its center pulsed violently, shrinking in on itself before exploding in a brilliant flash of light. The shockwave rippled across the battlefield, knocking enforcers off their feet and sending debris raining from the sky. The HFY team erupted in cheers, their victory hard-won. But Jake's focus was on Lyra, who leaned heavily against him, her glow faint but steady. The aftermath. The drone landed amidst the wreckage, where Captain Reed and his team awaited. Reed approached, his stern expression softening as he surveyed the scene. You did it, he said simply. Lyra nodded, her exhaustion evident. But they'll send more, she said quietly. They always do. Reed crossed his arms. Then let them. Earth's not so easy to push around. Jake smiled faintly, the weight of the night's events settling on him. He turned to Lyra. What now? Lyra met his gaze, a flicker of hope in her eyes. "I stay, if you'll have me." Jake's smile widened. "I think we can make room for one more." Closing hook. As the team regrouped, a faint signal crackled to life on the HDI's comms. Reed frowned, listening closely. "We're picking up chatter," he said. "Something big is coming." Jake exchanged a glance with Lyra, their bond stronger than ever. The battle was over, but their fight had only just begun.